The starship Eclipse drifted silently through the void, its sleek, obsidian hull reflecting the faint light of distant stars. On board, the crew of the Zorathians, a highly advanced alien species, went about their duties with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The Zorathians were a proud race, known for their technological prowess and their insatiable curiosity about the universe. They had explored countless worlds, encountered myriad species, and yet, they had never found a creature quite like the one they now carried in their cargo hold. In the dimly lit hold, a small, fragile-looking creature sat curled up in a corner. It was a human, a species the Zorathians had stumbled upon during their latest expedition to a remote planet called Earth. The human, a young male named Ethan, had been taken aboard the Eclipse as a specimen for study. To the Zorathians, humans were primitive, weak, and utterly unremarkable. They had no advanced technology, no extraordinary physical abilities, and no apparent value to the galaxy at large. But they were curious creatures, and the Zorathians were nothing if not curious. Ethan had been on the ship for several weeks now, and during that time, he had done little more than eat, sleep, and occasionally stare out the small viewport in his enclosure. The Zorathians had expected him to be frightened, perhaps even hostile, but instead, he seemed almost bored. This puzzled them. They had studied countless species, and none had ever reacted to captivity with such indifference. "What do you make of him, Commander?" asked Lieutenant Vera, the ship's second-in-command, as she observed Ethan through the transparent barrier of his enclosure. Commander Kale, the leader of the Eclipse, frowned as he studied the human. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "He's not like any other species we've encountered. He doesn't seem to fear us, nor does he show any signs of aggression. It's almost as if he's waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" Vera asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. Kale shook his head. "I don't know. But there's something about him that I can't quite put my finger on. He's not what he appears to be." As the days passed, the Zorathians continued to observe Ethan, but they learned little more about him. He ate the food they provided, drank the water, and occasionally engaged in some form of physical activity, but he remained an enigma. The crew began to grow restless, their initial curiosity giving way to frustration. They had expected to learn something new, something exciting, but instead, they were left with more questions than answers. Then, one day, something changed. It started with a faint hum, a vibration that seemed to emanate from deep within the ship. At first, the crew thought it was nothing more than a minor malfunction, but as the hours passed, the hum grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the ship itself was alive, resonating with some unseen force. Kale was in the command center when the first reports came in. "Commander, we're detecting an unusual energy signature," said Lieutenant Zorak, the ship's chief engineer. "It's coming from the cargo hold." Kale's eyes narrowed. "The cargo hold? What kind of energy signature?" Zorak hesitated. "It's hard to describe. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. It's not electrical, not thermal, it's something else entirely." Kale's mind raced. The only thing in the cargo hold was the human. Could it be? "Bring up the feed from the hold," Kale ordered. The screen in front of him flickered to life, displaying a live feed of Ethan's enclosure. At first, everything appeared normal. Ethan was sitting in his usual spot, staring out the viewport. But then, Kale noticed something strange. The air around Ethan seemed to shimmer, as if it were being distorted by some unseen force. And then, slowly, Ethan began to change. His body, once small and frail, began to grow. His muscles expanded, his frame lengthened, and his skin took on a faint, almost imperceptible glow. The Zorathians watched in stunned silence as Ethan transformed before their eyes, growing larger and more powerful with each passing moment. What is happening?" Vera whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. Kale could only shake his head, his eyes fixed on the screen. He had no answers, no explanations. All he knew was that they had underestimated the human, and now, they were about to pay the price. As Ethan's transformation reached its peak, the hum that had been resonating through the ship suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. And then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the barrier of Ethan's enclosure shattered, sending shards of transparent material flying in all directions. Ethan stepped out of the enclosure, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. He looked at the Zorathians, and for the first time, they saw something in his gaze that they had never seen before: power. "You should not have taken me from my home," Ethan said, his voice deep and resonant, echoing through the ship. "You thought I was weak, insignificant. But you were wrong." The Zorathians could only stare in stunned silence as Ethan raised his hand, and with a simple gesture, the ship's systems began to fail. Lights flickered, consoles sparked, and the ship's engine sputtered and died. "You have no idea what I am capable of," Ethan continued, his voice filled with a quiet menace. "But you will learn. And you will never underestimate a human again." With that, Ethan turned and walked away, leaving the Zorathians in a state of shock and disbelief. They had thought they were the masters of the universe, the pinnacle of evolution. But now, they realized, they had been wrong. There were forces in the galaxy far beyond their understanding, and they had just encountered one of them. As the eclipse drifted helplessly through space, the Zorathians could only wonder what would happen next. They had underestimated the human, and now, they were at his mercy. And they knew, deep down, that they would never be the same again. The eclipse was adrift, its systems crippled by the sudden and inexplicable surge of energy that had emanated from the human, Ethan. The Zorathian crew, once confident in their superiority, now found themselves in a state of disarray. Commander Kale stood in the command center, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. "Report." Kale barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Lieutenant Zorak, the chief engineer, was frantically working at his console. "Commander, the ship's systems are down. Life support is failing, and we're losing power fast. I don't know how much longer we can hold out." Kale clenched his fists, his mind racing. They had to find a way to regain control of the ship, but with Ethan's sudden transformation and the subsequent power surge, it seemed almost impossible. He turned to Lieutenant Vera, who was monitoring the ship's internal sensors. "Vera, where is the human now?" Kale asked, his voice tight with tension. Vera's eyes widened as she looked at the readings. He's in the engine room, Commander. But, something's wrong. The energy readings are off the charts. It's like he's absorbing the ship's power." Kale's heart sank. If Ethan was absorbing the ship's power, it would only be a matter of time before the eclipse was completely drained. They had to act fast. "Zorak, can we reroute power from the secondary systems?" Kale asked, his mind racing through possible solutions. Zorak shook his head. "Not without risking a complete system failure. The human's energy signature is too strong. It's like he's feeding off the ship." Kale's mind raced. They had to find a way to stop Ethan, but how? He was no longer the frail, insignificant creature they had taken from Earth. He was something else entirely, something powerful and dangerous. "Vera, gather a security team and meet me in the engine room," Kale ordered, his voice firm. "We need to confront him before it's too late." Vera nodded and quickly relayed the orders. Within minutes, a team of armed Zorathians was assembled, ready to face whatever awaited them in the engine room. As they made their way through the dimly lit corridors of the ship, Kale couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest. They had underestimated the human, and now they were paying the price. But he couldn't let fear cloud his judgment. He had to stay focused, for the sake of his crew. When they reached the engine room, the door was already open, and the air was thick with an oppressive energy. Kale stepped inside, his weapon drawn, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Ethan was standing in the center of the room, his body glowing with an intense, otherworldly light. The ship's power conduits were pulsing with energy, and it was clear that Ethan was drawing power from them. But that wasn't the most alarming thing. Surrounding Ethan were the ship's engines, which were now glowing with the same eerie light. It was as if Ethan had somehow merged with the ship itself. "Ethan!" Cale shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "What are you doing? You're killing the ship." Ethan turned to face Cale, his eyes glowing with an intensity that made the commander's skin crawl. "I am not killing the ship, Commander," Ethan said, his voice calm but filled with an underlying menace. "I am becoming one with it. This vessel will be my new home, and you will serve me." Cale's heart pounded in his chest. This was worse than he had imagined. Ethan wasn't just absorbing the ship's power, he was taking control of it. And if he succeeded, the Eclipse would no longer be a Zorathian ship. It would be his. "Stand down, Ethan," Cale said, his voice firm despite the fear that gripped him. "You don't know what you're doing. This ship is not yours to command." Ethan's lips curled into a faint smile. "On the contrary, Commander. This ship is mine now. And soon, the entire galaxy will be mine as well." Cale's mind raced. He had to find a way to stop Ethan, but how? The human was too powerful, and the ship's systems were already under his control. There had to be a way to disrupt his connection to the ship, but what? Then, an idea struck him. If Ethan was drawing power from the ship, perhaps they could cut off that power source. It was a risky move, but it might be their only chance. "Zorak," Cale said, turning to the chief engineer. "Can you shut down the main power conduits?" Zorak's eyes widened. "Commander, if we do that, we'll lose all power. Life support, engines, everything. We'll be dead in space." Cale nodded grimly. "I know. But if we don't stop him, we'll be dead anyway." "Do it." Zorak hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He quickly accessed the ship's control panel and began the process of shutting down the main power conduits. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he sensed what was happening. "You think you can stop me?" he said, his voice filled with a quiet rage. "You are fools. I am beyond your understanding." As the power conduits began to shut down, the lights in the engine room flickered and dimmed. Ethan's glow began to fade, and the energy that had been pulsing through the room started to dissipate. But Ethan was not so easily defeated. With a roar of anger, he raised his hand, and a surge of energy shot out, striking Zorak and sending him flying across the room. The chief engineer hit the wall with a sickening thud and slumped to the floor, unconscious. "Zorak!" Cale shouted, his heart pounding. He turned back to Ethan, his weapon raised. "Enough. This ends now." Ethan's eyes blazed with fury as he turned to face Cale. "You dare challenge me? You are nothing but insects, crawling at my feet. I will crush you all." Cale knew he had no chance against Ethan in a direct confrontation, but he had to try. He fired his weapon, but the energy blast had no effect on Ethan. The human simply absorbed the energy, his glow intensifying. Desperation gripped Cale as he realized the futility of his actions. They were outmatched, outpowered. There was no way to stop Ethan. But then, something unexpected happened. As the last of the power conduits shut down, the ship was plunged into darkness. The only light came from Ethan's glowing form, but even that began to fade. The human staggered, his body flickering as if he were losing control. What is happening?" Ethan said, his voice filled with confusion and fear. Cale's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. Without the ship's power to sustain him, Ethan's connection to the Eclipse was weakening. He was losing control. "Now!" Cale shouted to his team. "Take him down." The security team sprang into action, firing their weapons at Ethan. This time, the energy blasts had an effect. Ethan's body flickered and wavered as the energy struck him, and he let out a roar of pain. With a final, desperate effort, Ethan raised his hand, and a burst of energy shot out, striking the security team and sending them flying. But the effort seemed to drain him, and his glow faded completely. Ethan collapsed to the floor, his body limp and lifeless. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the ship's emergency systems. Cale approached Ethan cautiously, his weapon still raised. He knelt beside the human and checked for a pulse. There was none. Ethan was dead. Cale let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. They had stopped Ethan, but at a great cost. The ship was crippled, and they were stranded in the middle of nowhere. As Cale stood and looked around at the wreckage of the engine room, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. They had underestimated the human, and it had nearly cost them everything. But what if there were others like him? What if there were more humans out there, waiting to be discovered? Cale shook his head, pushing the thought aside. For now, they had to focus on surviving. They had to find a way to repair the ship and get back to Zoreth. But deep down, he knew that their encounter with Ethan had changed everything. They could no longer afford to underestimate any species, no matter how primitive they seemed. As the crew of the Eclipse began the long process of repairing their ship, Cale couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of something much larger, much more dangerous. And he knew that their journey was far from over. The Eclipse was a shadow of its former self. The once proud starship now drifted aimlessly through space, its systems barely functioning. The crew worked tirelessly to repair the damage caused by Ethan's transformation, but progress was slow. The ship's power conduits were fried, the engines were inoperable, and life support was hanging on by a thread. Commander Cale stood in the command center, his eyes scanning the readouts on the main console. The situation was dire, but he couldn't afford to show any sign of weakness. His crew needed him to be strong, to lead them through this crisis. "Report," Cale said, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. Lieutenant Vera, who had taken over as acting chief engineer after Zorak's injury, looked up from her console. "Commander, we've managed to stabilize life support for now, but it's only a temporary fix. We need to get the main power conduits back online if we're going to have any chance of repairing the ship." Cale nodded. "What about the engines? Any progress there?" Vera shook her head. "The engines are completely dead. Without power, we can't even begin to repair them. We're stuck here until we can get the main systems back online." Cale's jaw tightened. They were in a precarious position. If they couldn't get the ship's systems back online soon, they would be stranded in space indefinitely. And with the ship's communication array down, they had no way of calling for help. "Keep working on it," Cale said, his voice firm. "We need to get this ship moving again." Vera nodded and returned to her work, her fingers flying over the console as she tried to reroute power to the critical systems. Cale turned to Lieutenant Zorak, who was sitting in a nearby chair, his head bandaged and his arm in a sling. The chief engineer had been lucky to survive Ethan's attack, but he was in no condition to help with the repairs. "How are you holding up, Zorak?" Cale asked, his voice softening slightly. Zorak managed a weak smile. "I'll live, Commander. But I'm not much use to you like this." Cale placed a hand on Zorak's shoulder. "You've done enough, Zorak. Just focus on recovering. We'll get through this." Zorak nodded, but his eyes were filled with worry. "Commander, what if there are more like him? What if there are other humans out there who can do what he did?" Cale's expression darkened. It was a question that had been weighing on his mind ever since Ethan's transformation. They had underestimated the human, and it had nearly cost them everything. But what if there were others? What if there were more humans out there, waiting to be discovered? We'll deal with that if and when it happens, Kale said, his voice firm. For now, we need to focus on repairing the ship and getting back to Zorith. Once we're home, we can figure out what to do next. Zorak nodded, but the worry in his eyes didn't fade. Kale knew that the chief engineer was right to be concerned. Their encounter with Ethan had changed everything. They could no longer afford to underestimate any species, no matter how primitive they seemed. As Kale turned back to the main console, his mind raced with possibilities. They had to find a way to repair the ship, but they also needed to learn more about humans. If there were others like Ethan out there, they needed to be prepared. Vera, Kale said, turning to the acting chief engineer, I want a full scan of any nearby systems. We need to know if there are other ships in range that could assist us. We also need to know if there are any human colonies within reach. It's time we gathered all the information we can. Vera nodded and immediately began accessing the ship's communication array. The scanner hummed as it picked up nearby signals, but the system's limited range, now damaged, left much to be desired. As the crew worked tirelessly to repair the ship, Kale couldn't shake the gnawing fear in the pit of his stomach. They had been humbled in a way no other species had ever managed to do. They had underestimated a human, and in doing so, had nearly brought their entire race to the brink of ruin. Kale stood by the viewport, gazing out into the void of space. The stars, once a source of pride and promise, now seemed distant and cold. The crew of the Eclipse had never been closer to failure. And if there were more humans like Ethan out there, if there were more powers like his, they had only scratched the surface of a much larger and more dangerous reality. Commander, Vera said, breaking him from his thoughts, I've got a signal. It's faint, but it looks like there's a ship on the edge of our sensor range. It's not a Zorathian vessel. Kale's eyes snapped to the console. Who is it? Vera's fingers danced across the controls as she honed in on the signal. I'm not sure yet. The signal is weak, but I think it might be a human ship. The readings are unconventional. Kale's heart skipped a beat. A human ship? Had they found the source of Ethan's power? Had they found more humans who could do what he had done? Bring it up on the screen, Kale commanded. The display flickered to life, showing the faint outline of a ship, nothing like any Zorathian vessel. Its design was rough, primitive by their standards, but there was something about it that made Kale uneasy. This wasn't just any human ship. Vera's brow furrowed. Commander, the readings are getting stronger. It's approaching rapidly. Kale's mind raced. Was this a rescue mission? Or a threat? Had the humans somehow learned of their presence, or was this just a coincidence? Get ready for anything, Kale ordered. Prepare the crew for a possible encounter. We don't know what we're dealing with yet. As the crew scrambled to prepare for whatever awaited them, Kale's thoughts lingered on Ethan. The human had come from nowhere, with power beyond their understanding, and now, it seemed as though they were on the precipice of something far bigger than they had ever anticipated. The future of the Eclipse and its crew now rested on one truth: they had no idea what the human race was truly capable of. Days turned into weeks, and the Eclipse continued its slow, unreliable drift through the stars. The makeshift repairs to the engines held for the time being, but Kale knew it was only a matter of time before the ship ran out of power again. The crew had done their best to restore the systems, but without a full repair, they were still stranded. The only glimmer of hope was that their distress signal had reached a nearby space station. They were waiting for a response, but time was running out. Commander Kale sat in the command center, his eyes fixed on the star map that displayed their slow, seemingly endless journey through space. Lieutenant Vera worked alongside him, her brow furrowed in concentration. We've sent out multiple distress signals, Vera reported, but no response yet. It could be the station is too far away, or it could be that the signal was lost. Kale let out a long, frustrated sigh. We need to get back to Zorith. This ship is barely holding together, and the longer we wait, the more vulnerable we become. Vera nodded. I know, Commander. But we need more time to fix the systems. Without full power, we can't risk using the drive, and even if we did, we might not make it back. Kale's thoughts turned to Ethan and the inexplicable power that had surged through the human. Despite Ethan's death, a lingering sense of unease gnawed at him. Kale wasn't sure if Ethan had been a fluke, or if there were more humans out there like him, hiding their true strength until the moment they were provoked. I still don't understand what happened, Kale muttered. How could a human, a species so seemingly weak, have such incredible power? Vera glanced at him. We may never know. But there's something we do know now: humans are not what they appear to be. They might be primitive, but they're capable of much more than we anticipated. Kale looked back at the screen, deep in thought. He had underestimated the human species, and that mistake had nearly cost them everything. The Zorathians had once prided themselves on their technological superiority, but now, they had to face the reality that they were not the only advanced beings in the universe. The hum of the emergency systems echoed in the background, a constant reminder of how fragile their situation was. Kale made a decision. Vera, I want you to prepare for a full scan of nearby systems. If there's any chance we can find help, we need to seize it now. We can't stay here much longer. Understood, she replied, her voice steady. As Vera began the preparations, Kale turned once again to the viewport. The stars stretched out before him, distant and cold. He had once believed that the Zorathians were masters of the galaxy, but that belief had been shattered. The universe was a far more unpredictable place than he had imagined, and the human species had proven to be the most unpredictable force of all. But despite the fear and uncertainty, Kale could not shake the nagging thought in the back of his mind. What if Ethan wasn't alone? What if there were more like him out there, waiting to be discovered? Weeks of repairs had brought little progress. The Zorathian crew had done their best to patch the Eclipse back together, but Kale knew they were running out of time. The damaged ship could only last for so long in the harshness of space, and without the necessary resources, the crew was beginning to lose hope. Just when things seemed darkest, a sudden communication broke through the static of their damaged communication array. This is Station Z-47, a voice crackled over the comms. We've received your distress signal. What's your status? Kale's heart leapt at the sound of the voice. This is Commander Kale of the Eclipse. We've sustained heavy damage and need immediate assistance. We are stranded and in need of power and repair supplies. We've got a repair team on standby, the voice responded. Prepare for docking. We'll assist you in getting back to full functionality. Relief washed over Kale. Thank you. We'll be ready for docking shortly. As Kale prepared for the approach to the station, he couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. The encounter with Ethan had forever changed their understanding of the universe, and now they had to face the possibility that the human species might be a far greater force than they had ever imagined. As the Eclipse drew closer to the station, Kale made a silent vow to his crew. They had survived, but they would not forget the lesson they had learned. The universe was full of unknown dangers, and humans, it seemed, were among the most dangerous of them all. And when the time came, they would be ready.